Hey everyone, Beast here. I'm making this channel's first response video. I had been having trouble picking the topic for the next video and decided that responding to a video and the claims it asserts would be the best way for me to focus on a subject. The video I chose comes from a channel I've always hated, to be quite honest. I really despise their aesthetic. It seems really fake and corporate, and it rubs me the wrong way. It's to the point that if someone else espoused the same narrative but were independent, it might not tick me off so much. Let me know if you'd like more videos like this in the future. But anyway, the channel I'm picking is Unpacked, and the video I'm responding to is called Did Israel Expel the Palestinians?, where they weave a narrative that, as you will see by the end of this video, I think is wrong. But before I get into that, I want to preface this very clearly. Do not harass the creators of this channel or their associates. I think what they did here is wrong, but harassing them will only distract from the atrocity denial and justification that they did in this video. There is a difference between criticizing and exposing people and just straight up going after them. I'm going to repeat, if these people get any harassment, they will try to use that as an out for the substantive critiques of their videos, and after all the effort I put into this, I don't want that to happen. So, what's the conclusion of Unpacked's video? The Unpacked video argues the following. 1. The fighting beginning in November 1947 was instigated by the Arabs. 2. Israel was forced into a fight in May 1948 when all of the surrounding Arab states invaded. 3. The war aims of the Arab forces was annihilation. And 4. It's not clear why the Palestinian Arabs left. Each of these narratives and representations are wrong, and I will divide this video up, section by section, discussing each of these claims. To show that all of these claims are wrong, I'm going to do something which Unpacked decided wasn't important, which is to source all of my claims. I'll do this with footnotes showing the exact pages and texts I'm pulling from. You'll notice here, based on this screenshot I took, that they didn't even do the bare minimum of mentioning what they're basing this video on. Unpacked claims that after the UN partition plan was released, that
the Arabs launched a new wave of terror attacks on the Jews, attempting to undermine the hope for stability promised by the partition plan.
Notice how incredibly imprecise this language is. Which Arabs? Which Jews? No context is given at all. And if you don't know the history very well, you could be drawn to believe that it is one entire community attacking another entire community. Now, sometimes people tend to use words like the XYZ group to refer to a specific government. I think I do this in most of my videos too, but in this case, there's none of the context necessary to make that conclusion. It really just seems, from watching this video, that immediately after the partition plan dropped, the Arabs, not even the Palestinians by the way, at large, suddenly attacked the Jewish community at large. Unpacked also gives the Arabs a motivation, which was to undermine the hope for stability promised by the partition plan. How did they prove this? By providing zero evidence, of course. Now, what actually happened? In short, the Zionist paramilitary forces, the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, had, throughout the year of 1947, prior to any announcement of the partition plan, already been engaged in operations in which they had been attacking British and Palestinian positions. While Palestinians engaged in acts of violence, these were not of an organized military nature until after the partition plan was announced, and often involved responding to attacks from the Haganah and co. All of the interested parties knew well before the partition plan was announced that a war was going to erupt. For example, in October, a month before the partition plan was announced, Ben-Gurion, leader of the Haganah, was writing to senior military officials about his desire to form an army that could not only act on the defensive, but could also occupy parts of the prospective Palestinian state, and if possible, all of it. Well before this communication, the Zionists had very publicly staked a claim on the entirety of Palestine as a Jewish state, as in the Biltmore program in the early 1940s. The British were also keen to get out of Palestine, and on paper adopted a policy of non-interference. The Palestinians had a divided, incompetent, and unprepared leadership that was too busy engaging in political infighting, but they did publicly saber-rattle over the partition plan. However, it is clear that one side of this conflict was much more prepared and willing to engage in a war. The Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lahai were engaging in attacks in Palestine well before the partition plan. For example, in June 1946, the Haganah blew up 11 bridges connecting Palestine to the surrounding Arab states. In July of that year, the Haganah gave the Irgun the go-ahead to bomb the King David Hotel, which resulted in 91 people, Brits, Arabs, and Jews, being killed. The 12 months after the King David Hotel bombing saw a fourfold increase in attacks. Between the 2-year period of 1945 and 1947, there were over 1,000 casualties in Palestine due to these attacks. By the outset of the Civil War period, the Zionist forces were composed of 35,000 Haganah fighters, the Irgun with 2,000 to 3,000 fighters, and the Lahai with 300 to 500 fighters. In terms of weaponry, they had thousands of rifles, pistols, machine guns, and mortars. The Zionist forces' attacks on the British took a considerable lopsided toll from 1945 to November 1947, with 6 Brits dying for every 1 Zionist. The economic damage was also considerable. From October 1946 to August 1947, 90 attacks took place against trains, railways, and petroleum infrastructure. I'm not just mentioning these attacks for the fun of it. The Zionists' attacks against the British also played a huge role in the use of force by Palestinians. For example, the first incident of violence from Palestinians after the partition plan was announced, and also the event which some mistakenly attribute to the beginning of the Civil War period of the fighting, had nothing to do with the partition plan at all, and was not an organized attack from any Palestinian group. It was a revenge attack. The Lahai had raided a Palestinian family's house and massacred 5 random Palestinians. They mistakenly believed the family to be informants for the British, who had attacked the Lahai previously. The Abu Kishk family launched their attack in response, killing 7 Jews. The first organized Palestinian attack was also heavily influenced by this Anglo-Zionist war. On December 4th, the Haganah conducted a patrol around the village of Kfar Salame. The Haganah had no right whatsoever to conduct such a patrol under the British mandate, since they were given no policing powers and were considered a terrorist group. In this patrol, they were attacked, and afterwards they decided to post up in the neighborhood of Shahunat Hatikva. On the 5th, the British, who legally had the right to do patrols, sent an armored vehicle into the neighborhood which the Haganah blocked. On the 6th, the British intervened more heavily. According to the Haganah fighters, the British attacked in the middle of an exchange between the Haganah and unidentified snipers. According to the British, the Haganah shot at them first. Regardless of who struck first, the Haganah retaliated by blowing up a building in the nearby village of Kfar Salame. The villagers had previously noted to the Haganah that they wanted to maintain peaceful relations with them, and that any fighting was expressly the product of the outside rabble-rousers. But now, after this, they called upon the British to strip the Haganah of their weapons. They also called for the help of Hassan Salame, a commander in the Jaish al-Muqaddas, a militia that was connected to the Arab Higher Committee, which was the closest thing to a political leadership Palestinians had at the time. Since Unpacked made the decision to say the Arabs launched a new wave of attacks, it's important to note that there is ample evidence that many Palestinians were not interested in fighting the Zionists at all. The vast majority of Palestinians at this time were peasant farmers who didn't care about politics and were more interested in preparing for harvests in the spring than fighting a war. This is also reflected in what little military preparation Palestinians took. Simply put, the Palestinians did not have an army. Any armed forces they did have were created sporadically in December of 1947 and consisted of small bands that did not coordinate with each other very well and often were rejected by the villages they operated in. It was so evident that the Palestinians writ large as a society did not want a war that Israel's soon-to-be first prime minister said in March 1948 that,
"I believe the majority of the Palestinian masses accept the partition as a fait accompli and do not believe it is possible to overcome or reject it. The decisive majority of them do not want to fight us."
So, on this point, Unpacked is wrong on two fronts. One, they completely overgeneralized the Palestinian response to the partition plan. While some Palestinians did use violence, organized attacks did not take place unprompted, and there is an inordinate amount of evidence that a substantial amount of Palestinians did not engage in fighting or even wanted to. Two, Unpacked absolutely refused to include any information on the violence from the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, which was rampant before November 29, 1947, essentially removing from the Palestinians and Arabs a key motivation and casus belli. And notice, by the way, I offered here the mere common courtesy of not conflating the Jewish people writ large with the Haganah, Irgun, or Lehi. Unpacked also claims that the 1948 war, when all the Arab states invaded, was forced upon Israel. In their video, they say,
"In 1948, Israel's Jews were forced into a fight for survival when the hours-old country was invaded by its neighboring Arab states immediately after declaring independence."
However, the fact is that an Arab invasion of Israel was not a foregone conclusion, and that Israel's own actions of expulsion, massacre, and other atrocities spurred the Arab states into acting. Between the announcement of the partition plan in November 1947 and the Arab invasion in May 1948, 200 to 300,000 Palestinians were expelled by the Zionist paramilitaries. These refugees were forced into the surrounding Arab states, and Israel essentially foisted upon them a refugee crisis. Every month leading to the Arab invasion saw villages destroyed and its inhabitants expelled. In December, the Haganah attacked the village of Khassas, killing 15 Palestinians, including 5 children. In January, the village of Sheikh Badr was expelled by the Haganah as well. In February, the coastal village of Qasariya was also expelled by the Haganah. In March, the villagers of Abu Kishk and Sheikh Mawannas were forced out by the Haganah and Lehi respectively. By April, it was undeniable that there was a bloody struggle for the control of Palestine, and at this point, the number of villages being depopulated increased significantly. The Haganah and Co. launched their offensive at the start of April, and as this was happening, the UN began to step in. The Israelis under Ben-Gurion had accepted the partition plan where it created a Jewish state, but did not accept the parts that specified its border, saying the borders
"will be determined by force and not by the partition resolution."
This meant that, essentially, the Israelis were going to consider anything they could conquer as their borders, regardless as to whether the UN partitioned it for them. For some inexplicable reason, the partition plan began to seem like it was a bad idea that was only going to lead to more violence, so a Security Council resolution demanding a 3-month truce was workshopped by the US. On April 1st, the UN passed Security Council Resolution 43, calling for the Jewish Agency, the Israeli representatives, and the Arab Higher Committee, the Palestinian representatives, to be called before the UN to arrange a truce. The offensive, however, continued. Around the same time as this, Operation Nachshon was launched. Operational orders sent down to the troops were the following.
The principal objective of the operation is the destruction of Arab villages and the eviction of the villagers so that they would become an economic liability for the general Arab forces.
This was reflected in the ensuing attacks on Palestinian villages. All Palestinian villages were considered as military bases. Villages such as Qalunya, Saris, Beit Surik, Biddu, and most notably Deir Yassin were destroyed and had their inhabitants expelled. Deir Yassin was notable in that it was the host of a great and influential massacre. On April 9th, the village was occupied by the Irgun at the behest of the Haganah, and survivors reported how they were lined up, villagers against a wall, and were shot. Around 120 were killed. On April 17th, the UN Security Council approved a truce via Resolution 46, calling for a truce. The Israelis rejected the truce, while the Palestinians and the Arab states represented by Syria and the UN Security Council accepted it. The violence continued, of course, and villages continued to be depopulated. In fact, at this point, entire cities were being de-Arabized, such as Haifa. Attacks on Haifa began in December, but on April 21st, the British decided to leave Haifa, and thus Zionist paramilitaries could now move in. The Haganah was given the order to
kill any Arab you encounter, torch all inflammable objects, and force doors open with explosives.
The onslaught forced many Palestinians to leave, stepping over and on top of each other as they scrambled to get on evacuation boats. As Palestinians attempted to get to safety, the Israelis sniped at them, killing them indiscriminately. Soldiers looted their homes. By mid-May, 4,000 out of the original 70,000 number of Palestinians in Haifa remained. After this, the Arab states, minus Egypt because Egypt decided to take a while, decided to invade Israel between April 29th to April 30th. Around then, about 200 to 300,000 Palestinians were expelled by the Zionist paramilitaries and were forced into the surrounding Arab states. This decision was influenced by Deir Yassin, by the expulsions, and would likely have been deterred had Israel's leaders accepted the truce proposed by the UN Security Council resolution. Syria, as a member of the UN Security Council at the time, had accepted the truce. In short, Unpacked attempts to portray a narrative that the war with the surrounding Arab states was forced upon Israel, when in fact the decision to invade could have been curtailed by either approaching a truce agreement facilitated by either the US or UN, or not engaging in atrocities that riled up the Arab populations in the area. Unpacked characterizes the war as a fight for survival for Israel's Jews, and also claims that
the head of the Arab League, a coalition of surrounding Arab states, warned that partition would lead to a war of annihilation.
Here, Unpacked is implicitly referencing a couple quotes from some Arab leaders in order to make this argument. However, some recent research suggests that these quotes are either taken out of context or are completely fabricated. Concerning the quote mentioning a war of annihilation warned of by the head of the Arab League, Unpacked seems to be referencing a quote from Abdul Rahman Hassan Azem, who was the Secretary General of the Arab League, and to whom such a quote is often attributed. The quote usually attributed to him is the following: "The establishment of a Jewish state would lead to a war of extermination and momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacre and the Crusaders." But according to Israeli historian Tom Segev, this is a misquote. First, it is often attributed to May 1948, when actually it was from an interview in October 1947. The full quote actually begins with the sentence, "Personally, I hope the Jews do not force us into this war, because it would be a war of extermination and momentous massacre, which will be spoken of like the Mongolian massacre and the Crusaders. I think the number of volunteers from outside of Palestine will exceed the Palestinian population. I know that we'll get volunteers from India, Afghanistan, and China to have the glory of being martyrs for Palestine." Here, Azem expressed trepidations of what a war would look like, but did not express a promise or policy for an Arab invasion. The mention of the volunteers also points to this. As well, it must be noted that the use of the Mongols and the Crusaders is a comparison which paints the Zionists as the Crusaders and Mongols, who in the history of the Middle East committed large-scale atrocities until they were eventually defeated. This is likely what Azem was talking about. Ironically, considering how this misquote is used, he was even called
the most honest and humane among Arab leaders, one of the few Arabs in the world who has a humane outlook and ideals,
by the future Prime Minister of Israel, after condemning anti-Jewish riots in Egypt. As well, the speech he actually gave in May 1948 suggests quite the opposite of a war of annihilation, where he says, "Whatever the outcome, the Arabs will stick to their offer of equal citizenship for Jews in Arab Palestine, and let them be as Jewish as they like." Either way, Azem Pasha was the Secretary General of the Arab League, and this ultimately meant that a war was out of his hands, so regardless of what he wanted, he could not initiate a war of annihilation, or even a regular war for that matter. The other quote, often mentioned in telling the history of this war, which Unpacked doesn't really implicitly refer to, but also mentioned because it's relevant, is based on the claim that the Arabs threatened to throw the Jews into the sea. According to the research of Professor Shai Haskani, quotes attributed to a Palestinian and Azam Pasha regarding throwing Jews into the sea cannot be found in any contemporaneous source. The invading Arab armies definitely were planning on stopping the partition of Palestine and to prevent the creation of a Jewish state, but they did not plan on killing every single Jew from the river to the sea. Of the 3 massacres attributed to the Arabs, none were committed by the regular Arab armies or the ALA. Compare this to the Israelis, who, I will admit, had more opportunities to commit crimes, but still committed over 24 massacres. The nature of the Arab state's plan for Palestine was so disjointed and hobbled together last minute that it could barely be called a plan, and was evidence of the fact that they did not seriously intend to go to war in the first place. As one British general put it,
"The Arab statesmen did not intend war, but in the end, they entered Palestine and ordered their commanders to advance as a result of pressure of public opinion and a desire to appease the street."
Jordan, who somehow had the strongest army in the Arab world at this time, was only interested in annexing the West Bank as part of an implicit agreement with the Israelis. Jordan, of course, was interested in conquering all of Palestine, but recognized this as unrealistic. Should Jordan have conquered the entire territory, the plan for the Jews was to grant them an autonomous state within the kingdom. This isn't to say that the leaders of these Arab states did not engage in public threats or that they did not employ anti-Semitic rhetoric. They did, as was the case with the following quote from Jordan's prime minister in 1947, saying the Jews were responsible for starting the 2 world wars. Yes, I have read and studied, and I know they were behind Hitler at the beginning of his movement. There's no real need to defend Arab leaders who spoke like this. It's obviously wrong. Ultimately, though, Unpack's characterization of the intentions of the Arab regular and irregular armies is still based on some shoddy research, if any was actually conducted, and reference a quote removed from its context. The video, therefore, misrepresents the politics behind the Arab invasion. This section of the video deals with the worst of Unpack's portrayal of this subject. Unpack's video states the following.
I think a lot of the misconception is that Jews decided after the Holocaust, okay, time to all just go to Palestine and kick everyone else out. And that's not what was happening before 1948.
Immediately before Unpack's guest says this, the narrator poses the question.
The prevailing Palestinian narrative of the Nakba is that the Jews expelled Palestinian Arabs using force in a deliberate act of ethnic cleansing. What's the real story?
With the former statement essentially being the answer. Unpacked is wrong here for the following 3 reasons. 1, they present this as a Palestinian narrative, when in fact it is just history itself. 2, they conflate the perpetrators of this atrocity, the political and military leadership of the Zionist paramilitaries, with Jews as a people writ large. And 3, the deliberateness of the expulsion of the Palestinians is clearly borne out in the historical record. This claim is the easiest to disprove, and is the most atrocious of the atrocity denial that Unpacked engaged in. The Zionists' political leadership were very clear about their desire to ethnically cleanse Palestine. Naturally, as the political circumstances which they operated in changed, the way they expressed this desire changed as well. But by the time the partition plan dropped, an ethnic cleansing was the preferred solution. For example, David Ben-Gurion, leader of the Haganah and future first prime minister of Israel, was an outspoken advocate among his peers for forcibly transferring the Palestinians. In the late 1930s, Ben-Gurion said,
I am for compulsory transfer. I do not see anything immoral in it.
And noted the benefits of expelling the Palestinians, saying,
The compulsory transfer of Arabs from the valleys of the proposed Jewish state could give us something which we never had, even when we stood on our own feet during the days of the First and Second Temple, a Galilee free from Arab population.
Another future prime minister and then leader in the Jewish agency, Golda Meir, also shared this desire, saying, "I too would want the Arabs out of the country, and my conscience would be absolutely clear." They understood this would be opposed by the Palestinians, as Menachem Osushkin, a leader in the Zionist movement, put it, "Why should Muhammad all of a sudden leave our country? First, is there any hope that the Arabs who live in our country will agree voluntarily to hand over those millions of dunams to us?" As the decade turned into the 40s, Zionist leaders such as Chaim Weizmann went touring across America in order to pitch the transfer of the Palestinians. When Britain announced it would be leaving Palestine, Ben-Gurion began arranging regular meetings with a group historian Ilan Pape refers to as the Consultancy. The main thrust of most of these meetings involved the future of the country, such as its demographic balance, and it was composed of officials throughout many of the branches and departments of Israel's embryonic state. One of the members of this group was Yosef Weitz, who was the head of the land department of the Jewish National Fund, an org tasked with putting the land of Palestine into Jewish hands. His job saw him travel all across Palestine, visiting Palestinian villages, and trying to solve the question of how to get the Palestinians off of their land. His conclusion was ethnic cleansing. On one such trip, he said,
"Throughout the journey, my reflections were focused on that plan, about which I had been thinking for years. The plan of evacuating the country for us. I know the difficulties, but only through population transfer will redemption come. There is no room for us with our neighbors. Development is a very slow process. They are too many and too much rooted. The only way is to cut and eradicate them from the roots."
This is not the only quotation from this guy saying things like this. I'm showing a lot of restraint and not going over every single quote from this guy, just unreservedly advocating for ethnic cleansing. Returning to the leader of the Zionist movement at the time, he continued to argue that transfer was not only right, but was an integral part of Zionism, saying,
"Zionism is a transfer of the Jews. Regarding the transfer of the Arabs, this is much easier than any other transfer. There are Arab states in the vicinity, and it is clear that if the Arabs are removed to these states, this will improve their condition and not the contrary."
As the partition plan was announced, Ben-Gurion expressed the importance of having as few Arab citizens of a prospective Jewish state as possible, because with Israeli citizenship,
"It would only be possible to imprison them, and it would be better to expel them than to imprison them."
He also spoke on the demographic requirements for a Jewish state to be possible, saying,
"The total population of the Jewish state at the time of its establishment will be about 1 million, including almost 40% non-Jews.
And thus,
there cannot even be absolute certainty that control will remain in the hands of the Jewish majority. There can be no stable and strong Jewish state so long as it has a Jewish majority of only 60%.
To this effect, the Zionist leadership created what was known as Plan D, which supported the option of expelling Palestinian villagers as a general guideline. To everyone familiar with Ben-Gurion, this meant that they should engage in ethnic cleansing, since to him it would be better that as few Arabs as possible remained in the Jewish state. A month after the partition plan, Ben-Gurion invited Yosef Weitz into the consultancy, who as a leader in the JNF was intimately familiar with villages that they needed to expel based on his experience in previous transfer committees and the creation of files on hundreds of Palestinian villages. In connection to this very clearly expressed political project, villages were expelled and destroyed by the Zionist militias. As mentioned earlier, brigades were given explicit orders to expel Palestinian villages. In some cases, villages were considered by the impact they would have in causing other expulsions, such as the village of Yibna, which was destroyed and had its village expelled. The brigade's goal was the following. The aim is to force the Arab inhabitants to move. It can be assumed that delivering a blow to one or more of these population centers, i.e. Mejdal, Asdod, or Yibna, will cause the wandering, i.e. exodus, of the inhabitants of the smaller settlements in the area. This possibility is likely, especially in view of the wave of panic that recently swept over the Arabs of the country. Not only was Ben-Gurion aware that villages were expelled, he often publicly gloated about how great it was to see neighborhoods have no more Arabs, and even directly and personally gave orders to expel certain towns. In the case of Romema, he gave explicit and direct orders to
settle Jews in every house of an evicted semi-Arab neighborhood, such as Romema.
And in the case of Lifta, he was absolutely ecstatic to see it empty, saying to his colleagues,
when you enter the city through Lifta and Romema, there are no Arabs, 100% Jews. Ever since Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, the city was not as Jewish as it is now. In many Arab neighborhoods in the West, you do not see even one Arab. I do not suppose it will change. And what happened in Jerusalem and in Haifa can happen in large parts of the country. If we persist, it is quite possible that in the next 6 or 8 months, there will be considerable changes in the country. Very considerable, and to our advantage. There will certainly be considerable changes in the demographic composition of the country.
In the case of Lid and Ramla, Ben-Gurion was asked, "What shall we do with the Arabs?" He responded with a dismissive, energetic gesture with his hand and said, "Expel them." The expulsion of the Palestinian population can be attributed to actions like these. According to a June 1948 report from Haganah Intelligence, 55% of the Palestinians expelled can be attributed to the Haganah, 15% to the Irgun and Lehi, and another 14% fled due to fear, psyops, and expulsion orders from the IDF. This, of course, is an Israeli military source, so it doesn't give the entire picture of the expulsions, but it does indicate just how responsible these paramilitaries were in these expulsions. I assure you all, I have other problems with this video, but at this point it is merely issues of presentation of the subject, and I've mostly done all the work on the facts I'd like to. I think I'd like to go more into detail on the partition plan, but they were not specific enough there to warrant a response. If you think I left anything out, please tell me. But here, in this part of the video, I want to remove us from the factual and historical discussion to an analysis of the message of the video. The video was made because its creators believe there is a Palestinian narrative that makes Israel look bad. This leads us to the video's goal, which is to present an alternative narrative for its pro-Israel audience. So 1, they don't have to feel so bad, and 2, they can go around and continue to parrot this atrocity denial. In history, every presentation of facts is in and of itself an argument. There is no history of a subject that is neutral because a historian is making an argument that on such and such date, such and such happened. And that's fine in a vacuum, but where entire ethnic groups are herded into accepting a narrative specific to them, we move away from reason. In this video, I clearly argue that Unpacked is wrong, but this isn't a Palestinian narrative. It is a narrative based in the historical literature on this subject. In fact, I have somehow barely used any Palestinian-authored sources in a video on Palestine. If you pay attention to the real historical debate over the Nakba in 1948, you'll notice that the people arguing with one another cite sources from the other side, with no real issue because there are no sides, only historians trying to understand the past, using the sources available to them, and disagreeing on each other's conclusions. Being an Arab or a Jew who tells this story doesn't automatically create a separate narrative for one group. However we delude ourselves, we all live on the same planet.
Okay, it's time to get off my soapbox and to thank the real MVPs, the patrons, $7 and up patrons. They get shouted out at the end of the video for being amazing and supporting this channel. If you'd like to support this channel, please become a patron. If you cannot become a patron, like, share, comment, subscribe, do all those algorithm boosting things. And thanks for watching. Avocado Kirby, Khazikani, Plum, Rod B, Barberry Baby, Pyrotic Napalm, A Plumbus, Tim 20. Thank you all. Thank you all so much. All right, good night.